Chapter 7. The Guayana Region. Communal Practices and Solidarity Brigades Among Industrial Workers. Much ink has been spilled on the question of why Latin American countries cannot industrialize with economies that generate long-term, self-reinforcing backward and forward linkages. Indeed, recent history speaks clearly for what seem to be the Sisyphean challenges of development in the region. Instead of independent industrialization and autonomous growth, Latin American countries have tended, almost inexorably, to play the role of junior partners that depend on the global North's economies, which determine what and how they will produce. This happens, moreover, in a way that benefits not their own development, but the North's. Because it is so persistent, the region's economic dependency can seem almost like a destiny, an evil star under which Latin American countries were born that makes most of the profits and value they generate slip through their fingers, only to mysteriously reappear in the ledger books of US and European multinationals. It is true that Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina all underwent limited processes of industrialization in the mid-20th century. However, before that century ended, those hopeful national economies saw their fledgling industries cut back and their roles as dependent exporters of raw materials affirmed. As before, the rich countries went on getting richer, and the poor countries relatively poorer, while the south to north value transfer continued unabated. Why can't Latin American countries develop along lines they themselves generate independently? German-American economist Andre Gunder Frank was able to tear away many ideological veils that cover the issue of dependency, with an approach that looked at the world system as a structured organic totality. That perspective allowed him to refute the idea that capitalist development, wherever it takes place, is necessarily progressive. That might be the ideology we all receive, but for many countries, as Frank aptly pointed out, their position in the world system determines that their development is underdevelopment. In keeping with this holistic approach, Frank and his fellow dependency theorists understood that the logic of capital, when operating on a global scale, like capitalism inside a given nation, generates poles of development and underdevelopment, or the simultaneous generation of development in some parts and underdevelopment in others. This implies that not all boats of the world's nations can be lifted with the rising tide, as Adam Smith once optimistically suggested, but rather the rising of some nations depends on the sinking and subordination of others. The capitalist world system is thus, by nature, an unequal playing field. Once it is set in place, countries will enter as either central, core, or peripheral, dependent nations. If a new player somehow manages to become a dominant or central country, as South Korea did through a process begun in the 1960s, it will be the result of a reshuffling that guarantees that other countries and other peoples become its periphery, from which value can, in turn, be drained. The basic industries of Guayana. These reflections on dependency and value transfer can seem very abstract, as indeed any high-level schema concerning the nature of the capitalist world system will be. However, in Venezuela's Guayana region, which Cida Pascual and I are visiting as part of our investigation into grassroots movements and communal projects, dependency is not a mere abstraction, but rather a material, visible reality. Here, one can see the limits of dependent industrialization spelled out in concrete facts, precisely because the Guayana region is the site of a huge, planned effort at industrial development that got going with the inauguration of the hydroelectric projects on the Caroni River around 1960. The energy, the resources, and the technology were all dutifully secured and put in place. Yet somehow the goal of autonomous development remained elusive, even chimerical. This colossal effort, involving tens of thousands of workers and massive capital investments, may have led to some level of industrialization and reflected significant political will. However, as if some Greek oracle had spoken, This immense project turned out to be yet another expression of Venezuelan dependency. The new industry was not so much value capturing as value draining, in a further iteration of the dynamics of the unequal world system. When you drive towards the Guayanese industrial zone from the major city of Puerto Ordaz, you follow the twisting Orinoco River with its beige, silt-laden waters. The route passes by one gargantuan skeletal structure after another. Because of the deteriorated, abandoned state of these factories, it is an almost post-apocalyptic scene that emerges before your eyes. What you are witnessing are the so-called basic industries of Guayana, which do the first stages of iron, aluminum, and now gold processing. The first step in building the industrial complex of Guayana goes far back. In the 1950s, under the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, a small steel plant called Civenza was built. However, it had also been determined that the huge amounts of relatively silt-free water flowing from the region's Caroni River constituted perfect conditions for building hydroelectric plants that could fuel a wider range of energy-intensive industries. A series of dams, including the flagship Guri project, which generates 11,000 megawatts a day, were built in the 1960s, along with the Sidor steel plant and a pair of state-of-the-art aluminum plants. They were all expanded during the 1970s oil boom. The business model applied in this enclave was simple and efficient, triangulated as it was between almost free energy, cheap labor, and copious raw materials. Moreover, the semi-processed output generated by these industries could often be simply rolled downhill on narrow-gauge railways, then into waiting ships on their way to the global north. As we have indicated, the destiny of the country's dependency could not be undone by the project. Despite its scale and the resources invested in it, all this effort simply repeated the process of bleeding out that Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano referred to when he wrote about the open veins of Latin America. Economic value still flowed out of the region like blood, feeding the vampire of the North's industry and its development. In Venezuela, political regimes of all colors have attempted to overcome this subordinate condition. The dictator, the liberals, the Christian Democrats, and even Hugo Chavez tried their hand at breaking the spell of dependency that hangs over the Guayana industrial complex. Yet neither nationalization, mixed industries, privatizations, nor plans to diversify could overcome the dependent condition and produce the desired results. Independent development remained relentlessly elusive, and the new industries continued as mere appendices of capital accumulation elsewhere. The rusting structures in this industrial wasteland, some 60 years after the project got going, and the many unemployed or underemployed workers that populate the region are eloquent evidence of this. But now, there is a new way of working that is emerging from a handful of self-managed and occupied workshops in the zone, which may constitute the light at the end of the tunnel as far as dependency is concerned. This new modus operandi, coming from the grassroots, could be the game changer that Venezuelan people have been waiting for, and an example for other countries in the region. It represents a radical move away from the long-standing practice of just generating commodities for an anonymous international market, whose value seems to always slip away along the world's value chains, toward doing work for specific communities and with their explicit needs in view. Moreover, inside the self-managed workshops that a set of ambitious and politically conscious workers have occupied in Guayana, most of them shops that serve the metal industry, new practices involving solidarity, voluntary labor, and use value production are now in center stage instead of on the margins of the production process. This embodies the spirit or perspective of the Commune. It is interesting to see how communal values play out in the industrial setting of these metallurgy workshops. All of this has whetted our curiosity about the Guayanese industrial zone and helped us to understand that though there may be a few de jure working communes in this region of Venezuela, there are nevertheless emergent practices that respond to the same values, essential social relations, and guiding principles that underpin the communal movement elsewhere in the country. Importantly, the values of solidarity and mutuality not only orient production inside the occupied self-managed workshops, but they also have driven the most politically conscious workers to apply their skills as qualified technicians to help jumpstart production in different grassroots projects all over the country, including communes. With time, they have formalized this ambitious practice of sending solidarity brigades around the country, calling it the Productive Workers' Army. Overall, one senses that the new approach expressed both in these self-managed shop floors and in the Productive Workers' Army could be an initial step towards finally dispelling the specter of dependency in Venezuela. But this time, by framing development as something close to the ground that is shaped by people's real needs and goals as self-determined agents. Or at least that is the bright promise. A promise that has both social and ecological dimensions, held out by the new, more communal practices of production that are taking shape in Guayana these days. The stories we have heard about these projects in the region have inspired Sira and me to make the almost 500-mile trip from Caracas to investigate its self-managed workshops. Occupying Indorca. The epicenter of these emergent practices is composed of mid-sized worker-controlled ateliers that serve Guyana's basic industries. Foremost among them is Industrias del Orinoco, or Indorca, a metallurgy workshop whose niche is precision-machined parts and repairs for the steel industry. Indorca had been a private business until 10 years ago. However, repeating a pattern that has occurred throughout the zone, its owner began to shut down the plant in response to the new progressive labor law, the LOTTT, that the Bolivarian government passed in 2012 to give workers more rights. Since Indorca's owner had been reducing hands on the shop floor and removing equipment for some time, the workers had seen the writing on the wall and begun to prepare. This meant that when the shutdown eventually occurred, they were ready to act. They seized Indorca's installations, put a heavy chain around the outside gate, and slept by turns on site for 2 years to keep the owner from retaking control or sabotaging the business. Occupying the plant was a bonding experience that stuck with Indorca's staff and transformed their political consciousness. The story of the occupation of this metallurgy workshop, undertaken when Venezuela was just on the brink of its economic crisis, is rich with anecdotes that still circulate among its workers. After our taxi drive from Puerto Ordaz to the Indorca plant, we first tour the hangars where the enterprise's heavy machinery, including lathes and welding equipment, now operate. What we encounter inside these structures is a scene of impressive peace and order. 50 or so staff members working diligently and harmoniously in a remarkably non-antagonistic context. The operations seem efficient, smooth, and the atmosphere among workers amenable. However, the workers we talk to in the plant are eager to tell us that this radically changed environment is hard-won, the result of intense struggle. For example, when Indorca's workers originally seized the plant, putting the chain on the gate, they could not even get inside. This meant that they had to sleep by turns in an open thatched structure called a maloca by the entrance, fending off repeated attacks by the owner's goons and the police. They did this for 2 long years, showing impressive resilience and resourcefulness, since this was a time when severe shortages of basic goods were beginning to affect the country. They had to supplement their food with iguanas and plantains they scavenged nearby. One worker, nicknamed the Wizard, tells us how a group of the owner's hired goons assaulted and bound him one night when he was cooking cachapa corn pancakes on an open fire. The armed band not only robbed the workshop, taking away machinery and electric cables, but added insult to injury by eating the corn pancakes in front of the Wizard, who had been turned into a hog-tied spectator at his own dinner table. During this extended vigil outside the factory, a small group of Indorca workers traveled to Caracas to make their case for self-management before the government, based on Article 149 of the LOTTT, which makes occupying an idle factory legal. As workers from the interior, they had few contacts in the capital city, so they had no choice but to sleep in the streets, covering themselves with cardboard while living off white bread and cola drinks that they bought from street-side cafes. Eventually, the determined workers got an audience, not with Chavez, as they had hoped, but with a sympathetic military officer from his personal staff who put them in contact with the Minister of Labor. This is how Indorca got recognized as a legal factory occupation. Then, to get the business going again, they had to appeal to active workers in the zone who pitched in by bringing their know-how and replacement parts for the missing machinery and cables to Indorca. This help came mostly from the nearby self-managed workshops Equipetrol and Calderis, also in the Guayana zone, with the neighboring workers giving their abundant support voluntarily. The Indorca workers also implemented a radical form of horizontal democracy internally, along with equal pay for all workers and transparent bookkeeping. In this whirlwind of support and solidarity, in what was essentially a community barn-raising effort, Indorca's workers now began to look outside the confines of their own business. The experience of sharing that was born during the occupation process, especially the long days and nights spent in the Maloca, and the help from other workshops had transformed Indorca's workers profoundly, endowing them with a communal perspective. In the spirit of reciprocity, they now thought, we have received a lot of help. Now who needs our help? Jose Cheo Cedeño, a skilled machinist and the charismatic leader of Indorca's workers, remembers that period as a difficult but beautiful time. He recalls, we were without jobs, but worker solidarity kept us alive, and we began to think about our potential as a class. We realized that while we have no money, together we have a lot of acquired knowledge. Let's jumpstart a few factories together. This was the germ of the idea of what later became their Solidarity Brigades, or the Productive Workers' Army. As luck would have it, a union leader from a state-owned sardine processing plant in the coastal city of Cumana soon got in touch with the workers at Indorca, asking for help with their broken canning machinery. This was just the opportunity to express solidarity that Indorca's workers had been waiting for. They prepared a volunteer brigade for the coast. Cedeño, who is normally very serious and understated, brightens up when he tells us how this solidarity project got going. His story about how their brigade saved the sardine plant takes us beyond the daily routine of work on the Indorca shop floor to a narrative register that involves adventure, sacrifice, and high ideals. The La Gaviota sardine processing plant had been on hold for months, mostly because their oven for preparing fish meal was broken. The workers there did not know much about the industrial equipment and repairs. Cedeño tells us that after making a preliminary diagnosis of their problems, he gathered skilled workers and supplies from the Guayana region, incorporating volunteers from the two other nearby self-managed enterprises, the metallurgy workshop, Equipetrol, and the manufacturer of refractory material, Calderis, who had helped Indorca workers in their hour of need. Then the team of workers from these three workshops set off in a microbus for the coast. What resulted was a 5-day solidarity battle at La Gaviota, which after some ups and downs, including some skepticism from the on-site workers, got the sardine factory fully running again in 2016. This was, for all intents and purposes, the first step towards forming the still-to-be-named Productive Workers' Army. The Battle of La Gaviota was the fledgling battle of this non-conventional army. Learning, planning, and working together. The guiding values that had emerged in the practice of self-management at the Indorca atelier, including equality, horizontality, democracy, and transparency, are all on display when, shortly after touring the business's heavy machinery hangar, we are able to attend Indorca's monthly all-staff meeting. This assembly, which takes place over an entire morning with the whole staff arrayed around a conference table facing a giant whiteboard, is impressive, if low-key. There, both workers and administrators see each other face to face, discuss, debate, and plan. In the meeting, one can see how transparency expresses itself in this organization, with every expense and every entry in the budget, past and future, painstakingly explained to all workers on the whiteboard. Similarly, the organization's commitment to equality means that all employees receive the same pay, while democratic horizontality is interpreted as ensuring that the main decisions are taken by vote after long debates conducted in the assembly. Beyond these core values at Indorca, there is also a profound spirit of camaraderie and self-sacrifice, both in the rank and file and in the political cadres that work here. One of the most important of these cadres, who has made substantial sacrifices for both Indorca and its project of the Productive Workers' Army, is Sergio Requena. After the monthly staff meeting concludes around midday, we are able to interview him about his role in the project. A native of the Guayana zone, Requena received a university education and went on to occupy important roles in the state bureaucracy, the highest of which saw him heading the institution Corpivenza, charged with overseeing some 200 new enterprises that the Bolivarian government wanted to foster. As often happens, a change in ministers saw Requena out of work, but rather than cool his heels in what would likely have been a comfortable middle-class existence, he offered his services as an educator to the workers struggling at Indorca. There, he taught workers not only basic math skills, reading and writing, but also revolutionary theory. Requena's selfless work as an educator and his inexhaustible enthusiasm quickly won over the hearts and minds of Indorca's workers. Shortly after, when the Productive Workers' Army got going, he wholeheartedly joined the project and applied his energy and skills as a promoter and publicist for that new undertaking, including his set of influential contacts. Requena has an evident passion for the Productive Workers' Army. He picks up the story of this project, telling us how its Solidarity Brigades evolved in the wake of the battle at La Gaviota, its inaugural effort. That experience, especially the spirit of emulation it inspired in the workers in Commune, left the incipient Productive Workers' Army eager to continue applying their skills to jump-starting industries with new battles in other locations. The next battles of the Productive Workers' Army, relying on Requena's contacts, took a team composed of Indorca, Calderis, and Equipetrol workers all the way across the country to Barinas State, to a plant for making construction machinery, and another that makes farm equipment. Here, the workers had the honor of working in a project developed in Chavez's birthplace. The following year, 2017, saw a flurry of Productive Workers' Army activity, including work on natural gas plants. By then, the brigade had formally taken the name that it now bears. Requena tells us that they decided to call themselves a productive army to mark their difference from a military corps, and yet highlight the fact that they were fighting a non-conventional war initiated by the United States with its sanctions and other aggressions against the people of Venezuela. For this reason, Requena refers to the project as a non-conventional army in a non-conventional war. A high point for many participants in the Productive Workers' Army was working on the Amuay oil refinery, which is the third largest refinery in the world and the largest in the Western Hemisphere. The sanctions had hit hard at this plant and left it functioning at reduced capacity, with its hydrogen compressors, equipment needed to desulfurize oil for making diesel and gasoline, completely stopped. They also needed help with repairing soldering equipment and their damaged ambulance. As before at La Gaviota, this time there was also skepticism from on-site workers. The employees at Amuay, and especially the refinery's engineers, felt that their expertise was being threatened by a bunch of unknown workers who, whatever practical know-how they had, did not have any formal degrees to show. Resistance was not only about dignity and expertise. There was also the tendency, widespread in state-run industries, to replace rather than repair broken equipment, because of the kickbacks that new purchases permit. In effect, the management at Amuay did not want repairs because of their venality. Nevertheless, with patience and a certain amount of craftiness, the Productive Workers' Army managed to overcome these internal obstacles. Requena tells us that he was particularly delighted to see how, when the bosses denied the brigade use of a forklift, a worker of Goliath-like proportion broke ranks with management and stepped in to lift the machinery himself. To Requena, this showed that even if management resisted, the workers at the refinery were committed patriots and revolutionaries. New rules, new practices. We have said that the productive workers' army contrives to change the rules of the game in an effort to break with the condition of dependency. What are those rules? Economic dependency is partly a result of the separation of workers, enterprises, and even countries that imperialism imposes, according to the time-tested methods of divide et impera. That is, the weakness of dependent economies responds in great measure to a logic of atomization that capitalism generates both inside countries and among them. On a micro level, for example, it is easy to see how in a given neighborhood, we often don't know what our neighbor does, what their skills are, and what they need. Instead, we turn to the market to get what we require and to solve our problems, and we expect our neighbor to do the same. In this way, we become more and more dependent on the market. On a larger scale, such atomization applies to whole countries that exchange with one another only insofar as it serves a particular niche determined by the world system's profit-making requirements. In peripheral countries, the logic of atomization reaches extremes, with each business existing as an oasis or enclave that is more connected to the global market than to what its neighbors do. Tellingly, it was when neighbors broke the rules of the market and pitched in to get Indorca going, particularly workers from Equipetrol and Calderes, that the idea for the Solidarity Brigades was born in his workshop staff. They thought, we have been helped by our neighbors in a spirit of solidarity that defies market relations. Now where can we apply our own skill in a like manner? Requena, likely because of his work as a popular educator, uses plain language to describe their new practices of solidarity. He calls the process of reaching out to one's neighbor, whether an enterprise or individual, crossing the street, cruzando la calle. This kind of reaching out becomes especially important as a means of overcoming the situation in which there are two businesses that engage in complementary activities, literally often on opposite sides of the street in Guayana's industrial zone, yet each works in a kind of bubble. Crossing the street, then, is what got Indorca going again, when its owner tried lockout and sabotage to stop the process of worker control. Workers from nearby Equipetrol and Calderes came over to lend them a hand. Then, Indorca workers returned the favor by crossing a street that is as wide as the country to get some 15 other enterprises going with the productive workers' army. Capitalism fragments everything, and each business has its own little ruler, Requena says. The main problem is that there isn't a centralized production plan, but add to that the fact that within the crisis, and the disorder that comes with it, some particular economic interests have surfaced, and you get the picture. Requena is conscious that breaking down these barriers, overcoming what he calls the archipelago logic, is far from easy, and often nothing short of a heroic task. For this reason, he compares the productive workers' army to the epic feat of Simón Bolívar sending a liberating army around Latin America 2 centuries ago to free other countries after Venezuelan emancipation had been achieved. However, the parallels reach even deeper in Requena's view, for just as for Bolívar and his emancipating army, morale was a key factor. So the workers in the productive workers' army conceive their project as not just repairing machinery, but also repairing consciousness. They try to teach by example, and in so doing, raise people's morale, instilling the socialist and communal principles that their own volunteer work embodies. These principles, including mutual encouragement and two-way learning, came to a head in the 13th battle that the Productive Workers' Army undertook. This battle was also the first to be staged in an up-and-running commune. It occurred at El Maizal, Chapter 1, which is probably the most consolidated rural commune in the country, with a solid project and a committed set of communards to back it up. As such, El Maizal is far from the creeping desperation that now affects many Venezuelans in either urban or rural contexts. Nevertheless, the presence of volunteer workers who help them repair their mechanical milkers and refrigeration units, along with a tractor and an electrical manger in early 2019, served as a wake-up call, broadening their horizons and spurring their ambition. This project brought revolutionary industrial and agricultural workers together for the first time, and the results were promising. Winds of change. There is a long history of organizing volunteer work in the revolutionary left, reaching from Lenin's Red Saturdays to the Chinese Brigades of the Great Leap Forward to the Cuban Revolution. It is well known, partly because of an excellent photographic record, that Che Guevara, during his time in Cuba, put great emphasis on voluntary labor as a means of generating a new attitude towards work and transforming the human subjects themselves. Guevara not only participated in voluntary work himself, driving tractors and cutting cane, never shirking the most difficult tasks, but he also theorized its importance, emphasizing voluntary work's role in forming socialist consciousness. He called voluntary labor a school for creating consciousness. Che's idea responds to a long-standing concern in the Marxist tradition: how to transform people in a society in which all of us are organized by the logic of capital. Che, following these developed by Marx, believed that such transformation is done through revolutionary praxis, especially cooperative work of the kind that the Productive Workers' Army has carried out and attempted to inspire in its trips around the country. In these 5 to 7 day stints, selfless collective work activities help generate the new human beings who work for social rather than selfish reasons, even as the values expressed in these work contexts foreshadow a future society based on superior social relations. By breaking the rules of the capitalist game in even a small corner of the world, as the Productive Workers' Army has done, one opens a window in consciousness on the new society we can build. No society is static, least of all one that has undergone a recent revolutionary transformation. Today there are winds of change blowing in Venezuela, and an economic recovery is said to be taking place throughout the country. This recovery is visible and real, even if its bases are somewhat mysterious, and it is experienced unequally, with some, mostly middle-class Venezuelans, obtaining the resources to buy new vehicles and open new businesses, while others lag behind and find themselves in a country that offers limited education and precarious health services, while facing a host of bureaucratic issues that have been exacerbated by the blockade. In Indorca, we can see how the winds of recovery are bringing the possibility of new and more contracts, better salaries, and plans for expansion. This can be seen on the shop floor, where things are evidently picking up, and also in the offices, where new plans are being laid. A brighter, if clearly still precarious, future is showing its head, which will translate into expanded production, involve more workers, and recover employees' benefits. In these future scenarios, the Productive Workers' Army, which to date has carried out 15 battles in different state-owned or worker-run enterprises and communes, could also play an important role, with its brigades being activated and even amplified in future scenarios. The economic recovery that is part of the new national context should be viewed with a critical eye. Its uneven nature and essentially capitalist character have become increasingly evident to Sira and me, in part because of the hard situation of many rural producers in the communes we visited in our travels. For this reason, in our last conversations with Sereno and Requena in the Indorca offices, we discussed the problems of the Cinco Fortalezas commune in Cumanacoa, which we visited just a month before, and its inability to process the sugarcane that lies unharvested in its fields because of a broken sugar mill. They are interested by the project. With this in mind, a plan is beginning to take shape to organize the Productive Workers' Army's 16th battle in this needy but combative commune. There is also the possibility, which we discuss with them, of working with the newly founded Communard Union to coordinate the Workers' Army's Solidarity Brigades. The linkages that the Union is now generating among communes could give the Productive Workers' Army a clearer picture of where its efforts can be most useful. Here, there seems to be enormous potential, and the Workers' Army's battles could eventually involve thousands of workers working hand in hand with communards. In this way, the web of communes that Chavez saw as a necessary step in the socialist transformation could benefit from the skill and, above all, the revolutionary spirit of these committed industrial workers who, rather than attempting to merely overcome the country's dependency in relation to the centers of capitalism, are now working to change the rules of the game entirely through the new labor relations this project embodies. These relations, admittedly in a small, if potentially expandable microcosm, constitutes an emergent sociality in which the polarizing terms of dependence, centrality, and subordination are being replaced by a new way of relating on the basis of solidarity, mutuality, and complementarity.